Hi, this is Dan Sullivan, President of the Council of Georgist Organizations. We're doing a follow-up roundtable discussion after yesterday's presentation on a Georgist response to the Green New Deal. This is all made possible primarily by support from the Robert Schalkenbach Foundation, also the Foundation for Economic Justice, the Henry George Institute, Common Ground USA, Earth-Sharing Institute, and personal donations. Thank you. I'm going to turn this over to Ed Dodson, and he's going to explain how he has the format set up.
Okay, Dan, are you going to return my PowerPoint to the screen? Okay, great. So everyone should see the first slide in a PowerPoint. Basically, what I've done is I had access to the video recording from yesterday.
You still have to share your screen.
I haven't done that?
I unshared mine, but yours isn't showing.
Okay. There?
Yep.
Okay. So we've got the technology working well. Let's hope it continues to work well. But I had access to the video recordings of the sessions yesterday, and from that, I put together 10 slides with questions to put to Marty, Alana, and Dave to stimulate some discussion. So these questions are addressed basically to all three of them. Any or all three of them can respond to the question, and any and all three of them can respond to one another. If the question that's on the screen raises another issue for them, they can certainly carry on. So this is not to be too formal, but I wanted to at least have a number of questions directly related to their presentations that we could expand upon in our discussion today. We're going to go 90 minutes and stick to that time pretty religiously. And as yesterday, if you're attending this and you have a question, put the question on the Q&A screen, and eventually we'll try to get to those as time permits. So the first question that I want to put to the group relates to the situation today compared to the 1930s. And let me get, okay. In his presentation, Marty made the link between Henry George's proposal for the capture of rent of land and what he called societal resiliency. He's described what is possible. This raises the question of how much time we have to get there before systemic failure is likely. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm reading the wrong. My PowerPoint at home went one screen in advance, so forget what I just said. I'm sorry. But still relating to Marty, in his talk, he described the history of the Roosevelt administration's New Deal initiatives as primarily driven by channeling funding to private enterprise or providing government guarantees on loans made by banks to stimulate economic development and even home ownership. The general belief is that these efforts fell far short, that what brought the nation out of the Depression was preparation for war. How do each of you see the effects today of huge spending on the military? And you have to unmute yourself in order to make yourself heard.
Is that the military question you'd mentioned, Ed?
Yes. You don't have to do it now. We can do it later, but certainly feel free.
Well, I'll start with just a bit on that. I mean, in terms of Green New Deal and the environment, the United States military is the biggest institutional polluter on the planet. Massive wastage, carbon pollution, certainly land site wasting, and all kinds of chemical pollutions. Not to mention the devastation from all the bombings and the militarization and the wars throughout the world. So that is how it relates. And I had a few slides because yesterday I had mentioned I thought it was really important now to connect Georgist economics and the war and peace analysis with people in the military. So I put together a few slides and quotes, and it actually did come from someone, a general, at the period of FDR. So sooner or later, I'll.
Well, how about let Marty and Dave comment, and then we'll stop there, and you can pull up your PowerPoint. But okay. one of the aspects of what I got from Marty's presentation, Marty, was this battle we had then between guns and butter, and the same issue today. Can we afford both guns and butter?
Yeah. So this is Marty. I'm registering.
You're registering.
Okay. Yeah. So the points I was trying to make was maybe a little bit different, but I think it's good to discuss the link between then and now. And I think what was going on from what I said yesterday was that there was a reluctance in the private sector to invest, to take chances. They're risk averse, and so what the FDR and his New Deal programs did was to move the economy in a direction that the government wanted them to go. For example, the rural electrification, FHA and the Defense Plant Corporation. So in my example, what I showed is a possible alternative to what the New Green Deal is asking for, and focusing in on a program that could direct funding that no private sector would do on its own, and that was to provide the development corridors to redevelop the Rust Belt, primarily going around Illinois and Ohio. I did revise that slide to refine it because somebody asked, I think it was, it was asked about how would we acquire that land. So I do have some slides on how to answer that question, but I think there's always, well, I guess I really didn't get into the war actually saving the economy. I think what was happening is that the industries that were developed had lended themselves to mass production. That was one of the interesting things that I saw on TV. They were talking about the history of the automobile or Ford Motor Company. I can't remember, but they made a real big point about the vice president of Ford being like a general or something in wartime production. So there's a lot of interchange between the private sector and the government. So I think it's really just what I'm suggesting is that we do what was done in the New Deal era, and also in the space program was we have a mission. Federal government directs where the money should go, and the private sector comes on board. So that was what I contributed.
Okay, great. Dave, do you have any thoughts on this issue? The balance between, I mean, what role the military spending has in the economy, and thinking back on your what your country went through, approaching the Second World War, and then in most recent times.
Yesterday was our Queen's birthday, and she's in lockdown in Windsor Castle and the huge grounds. And so they had the Welsh Guards with their busby helmets marching 6 feet apart from each other, playing the band and moving their weapons, on the shoulder and all the rest, in their very bright scarlet tunics. And to me, that is a sensible role for the military. It attracts tourists in normal times, but I wouldn't have the military doing anything else at all. I wouldn't have them going abroad, killing people. I wouldn't have Trident and nuclear submarines. I wouldn't have money wasted on building and using tanks and all the rest of it. My granddaughter went on a 2 month visit to Costa Rica last year, where she was working in a wildlife sanctuary, and she came home and told me about how they got rid of their military in 1946, and that's what I think we should be doing worldwide, and particularly here in the UK. We waste our money on the military, and worse, we waste it on scientific inventions to be used by the military, when Japan and Germany were using their scientists to develop cars and consumer goods. We were wasting it on weapons that were obsolete by the time they came into use. So I think the military is a huge drain on our resources, and the best thing is to disband them, keep a few for ceremonial purposes, and let's have those people employed in productive work.
Kind of an irony that after the Second World War, you know, the Japanese and the Germans, you know, prohibited from rearming, shifted their emphasis to developing a modern industrial economy, and did so well. But they were, you know, protected to a degree by the military expenditures by other countries, by the victors.
Protected from what?
Well, that's the question, whether or not they would be have been exposed to any attack by another territory acquiring, you know, economy or society. I don't know. I mean, the Russians, the communist Chinese, the you know, that was certainly the atmosphere of the 1950s and 60s and all the way up until, you know, recent times even. But that
was the atmosphere, but what was the evidence that Stalin or any of the later leaders of the Soviet Union or Mao Zedong or his people wanted to go out and attack anybody?
Yeah, those are very valid points. We don't have time to get into that. It would be a great discussion if we get some historians on a future program at some point. Alana, did you want to bring up the PowerPoint slide that you had prepared? Did you want to do that now?
Yeah, while I'm bringing them up, yeah, you'll give me the screen share. I'll click that so you can continue till you see the slides up.
Okay.
Talking.
I guess I have to unshare my screen so you can share yours.
Okay.
Okay, I'm stopping my sharing.
There you go.
Okay. Okay, you guys see that? What is the true cost of war? Is it operative? Can you see it yet?
Nothing's coming up yet.
Okay. Let me do, I have to do okay.
Did you click on your share screen and then click on the PowerPoint itself?
Coming up.
Okay.
Now you see it, right?
No.
Yep.
Okay, so yesterday I had mentioned that I thought it would be very good if we were to begin to have dialogues with people in the military. And before I go through these 4 or 5 slides, I prepared maybe 5 or 6. I wanted to say that a few years ago, I was a citizen participant in the National Security Seminar at the U.S. Army War College, and they divvied the 200 or so of us up into their class groups of about 10 classes. But then they had all the classes, we all made a vote on whether we were for or against the Iraq War. And half of the U.S. Army War College participants, the military guys, were against starting the war in Iraq. During that time, I met Colonel Dempsey, and Colonel Dempsey asked me to talk in one of his classes thereafter to talk about poverty and root causes of poverty and war. So there are numbers of military who would like to find non-militaristic solutions. They go in there and they see the poverty. So true cost of war, I'm wondering how many of you have heard of Smedley Butler, General Smedley Butler.
Yes.
Yeah.
Trying to get my,
Yes.
my PowerPoint to shift. So, quote from him: newly placed gravestones, mangled bodies, shattered minds, broken hearts and homes, economic instability, depression, and all its attendant miseries, back-breaking taxation for generations and generations. Major General Smedley Butler. Here's a picture of him. He was a senior United States Marine who fought in both Mexican Revolution and World War I, was at the time of his death the most decorated Marine in U.S. history. Born 1881, died 1940, Philadelphia, and all these awards he won. Now, he wrote a little book. After he was away from the military, he started thinking about what he'd really done and what had really happened, because he said in the military, we didn't have time to think. He was top general, no time to think. And his incredible book, well, this is from that. A racket is best described, I believe, as something that's not what it seems to the majority of people. Only a small inside group know what it's about. It's conducted for the benefit of the very few at the expense of the very many. Out of war, a very few people make huge fortunes. There are only two things we should fight over. One is the defense of our homes, and the other is the Bill of Rights. War is a racket. It's the only one international in scope. It is the only one in which the profits are reckoned in dollars and the losses in lives. War is just a racket, I believe, inadequate defense at the coastline and nothing else. Now, there are links here. This is his actual, it's short. He's speaking on politics. It's very powerful. This was 1936. Then the audio book of his book, War is a Racket, you can find on YouTube. And then another one, it's 8 minutes on Smedley Butler and the plot to overthrow President Roosevelt. They didn't like what Roosevelt was doing about going off the gold standard and other of his programs. They were accusing FDR of bringing in communism. And they hatched a plan, and they went to Smedley Butler. They wanted him to lead the plan to getting the American Legion veterans, active and other military people, to essentially disempower President Roosevelt and put in a fascist leader. So they caught on to, he said no, he said absolutely no, and then he leaked their plan, and then it was reviewed in Congress that they really were trying to hatch this plan for a coup for the United States. He is a hero. I would say he is a hero among Veterans for Peace groups. There's Veterans for Peace groups coming out of all our recent wars, Vietnam and Iraq. Mostly they're now under the one umbrella simply called Veterans for Peace. And some of them are very articulate. There's a lot of guys who are questioning what our wars are all about. And I think they would love to hear our message. And here is how I think with our wonderful slides that we had put together decades ago, and Lindy Davies put them in a nicer visual form. They're very simple: essentials of economic rent and a war economy. In a peaceful, just, harmonious society, everyone has fair access to the gifts of nature to procure their livelihood. But then when rent is charged for land and resources, you see a gun above the point rent. And then therefore people can't afford to capitalize themselves or buy a home without mortgages. Then you have the violence of this kind of usurious interest. So there's two guns, and this surplus value or unearned income then begins to create a privileged fund. Collectors of the privileged fund invest in land and resources in so-called underdeveloped countries, and to quell protests, investors call for military intervention. So then you have a whole full-blown global war economy, and you have foreign investments are made to extract resources around the world backed up by our military.
Alana,
What? One more slide.
Alana, have you recorded this to make it available on YouTube? as a with
You know,
audio?
no.
That's probably, I would strongly recommend that you do so, and then others can advise where to find it.
Okay, I'll do it. So here's the last of the 4 slides. And this is when you see the role of governance to collect the resource rent, the commons rent, the land rent, the surplus for the people as a whole. You see a new form of government, which I've been calling Earth Rights Democracy. It's a new mandate for democracy to collect the resource rents and distribute it equitably for people's needs. So there you see again, this intervention of resource rent, you now have a stabilized, harmonious, peaceful economy once again. So I think these are simple to understand graphs. The concept of rent, we always have to explain a little more as Georgists, but I think the presentations that we can give can be short to members of the military, and so that we can enter into dialogue with them, because surely many are aware about the grab for resources around the world and the wars for resources. So I would look forward to us having this kind of Zoom conference in the future. Okay, that was my main input for now.
Okay, why don't you unshare your screen? I'll reshare mine. In the meantime, Dave and Marty, do you have any questions for Alana or comments?
Yeah, this is Marty. I think it was good what Alana presented, but I'm thinking that so if not war, then what do we rally around? And I think
Life.
Yeah, well, but so.
I mean, the whole green movement we're talking about, Green New Deal, is around life.
Yeah.
And it's really, it's coming down to life or death. Yeah. I mean, climate change, all these horrible things, wealth inequality is death. Yeah. And the fair economy is the vision we work for, which is life.
Yeah. Well, but I guess what I'm thinking is that, at the table where people discuss what do we do next, there's always going to be people that we oppose, and we can always say that we should invest, collect the rent, but kind of like what the New Deal did, because the economy was at a standstill, they had to intervene. But if you take the argument and go backwards, why was there an economic depression? We can say that it was the failure to heed Henry George's warnings and had all that speculative rent, and so a lot of the reforms that came out of the 30s was to make it less likely that we would fall into that trap. But the message of adhering to a Henry George point of view kind of went into the background, and we simultaneously had the birth of the neoclassical economics and neoliberalism. So we can say that we should collect the rent, but there's a lot of nefarious forces out there that need to be countered, and they often are not sufficiently countered. I guess the other thing I wanted to add was that Giannis had a good question, and I'm not sure if he meant it tongue in cheek, but I thought it was good, and I was going to respond to it. He says, since Germany is now controlling Europe, even in a bigger scale than before World War II, do you think 60 million lives sacrificed for the sake of World War II were in vain? I think that perhaps he was making a joke, but I was thinking that essentially what happened in World War II was that it postponed the thrust of Germany becoming a more powerful nation within the others. So that's one way to look at that question. Another way would be to look at the war on China 120 years ago, when the hundreds of tons of opium were put into China, to the point where in 1900, 27% of the adult males in China were addicted to opium. So if you look at the analogy I made about Germany, So 120 years later, they're in a dominant position. So there might have been forces at work in both situations that saw some threat. So they declared the war so that they could maintain their dominance. So now here we are, the effect of those old wars have worn off, and here we are. So I think we have forces that may not be obvious that maybe need to be countered. So rather than just say we need peace, we actually need something a little bit more, like a program. That's why I mentioned the idea of the development corridors, because we're at a point where it's more, we need more than just interstates. Interstates are clogged with pollution and oil consuming automobiles. And I think Dave had a good example about I think he called them freight tubes. So I came up with a diagram overnight and show how that idea would work. So I guess I'm just think that we need to rally around programs that can implement the visions that we have. That we just can't sit in the bleachers saying things. That I think we need to be active.
Of course. I mean, this is what the Green New Deal is. It's a vision for a planet of peace and justice and harmony. It's very spelled out. What's missing is a very, very great clarity about programs and policies to implement it and actually put it in place. And that's why we're here talking today.
Yeah, well, I guess that's the point that I made on one of the slides, that we're at 8% renewables right now. So what is the cost of going from 8 to what, 40%? And is 40% renewables going to achieve the climate change level that we need, or do we need to have an 80% renewables? And if we don't include nuclear, for example, then what's going to replace that? So there, I think we need to think hard about what it is the Green New Deal is saying. I'm not against the ideas of circular economy and reuse, and Kate Rayworth's ideas about regenerative economics, but that's why I was thinking about of course, stop the crazy wars.
But the 50% of the military budget would go a long way towards renewable energy development. Conversion of the military to do what's needed to be done to address all the problems. I mean, really, we're talking about how we get more people to think about the importance of taxes, not the importance of who you vote for, because whoever is president is a result of the society as it is. They're a symptom of what the society is. If we say the president's a problem, we got to get to what created this president or any president, because the president always becomes a problem because our problems are never solved. See what I'm saying?
What you two bring up, and even what Dave was talking about, the objectives of eliminating the military as all but a very minor presence in any society, it really does relate to the next question that I'm putting to you. How much time do we have to achieve systemic change? Marty made the link between Georgia's proposal to capture rent and the necessity of doing so for societal resiliency. And this raises the question of how much time do we have to get there before systemic failure is likely to occur. I know, the three of you aren't scientists, you don't have a crystal ball on this, but right now there's no global demand for the capture of rents. I mean, at best, there's a little bit of interest in countries, some individuals, a little bit of action that we all, just respond to with great excitement when we hear anyone, expressing a positive response to this. So the question I guess for you is, what measures can be implemented in order to buy time while we work for systemic change? How can we buy time? Because we we're not gonna get there anytime soon, but we have to prevent systemic collapse.
Yeah.
Well, that's going local. I mean, sharing and caring and getting gardens. People have food, more people gardening instead of these big backyards with nothing in them but grass. I mean, if it's an emergency, we have to start doing it where we live and then connect all the different places where we're living and form a power base that's outside of the current power structure that's destructive.
Mm-hmm.
Get to our city town councils where we can eyeball to eyeball, where we can come out and actually be a force for change, which we can on the federal level. It's pretty well wrapped up. It's pretty well hopeless. I mean, now I'm going to say something rather astounding maybe, but I had come upon kind of prophetic voices years ago. Before the collapse of the Soviet Union, they said that after the Soviet Union collapsed, the United States would collapse. Now, that's hard to believe, but you look at what's happening now. There's very horrific divisions in the United States. And there are, from a number of places, designs, thoughts. Everything begins in human thought for regional governance for the United States. There was even that book, Ecotopia, and I mentioned it yesterday, envisioning the Pacific Northwest plus British Columbia breaking away, forming its own separate state so that it could be ecological. So either one way or the other, I think that with a massive dysfunction on the federal level, and it's still functioning, it's functioning for the 1%. But the struggle ahead is a two-party system is not going to take us where we need to go. And people are breaking from the two-party system now everywhere you look, including this guy, Rick Wilson, who helped elect 2,000 Republicans and get 38 states to be Republican over years. He was very effective. And he just has a New York Times book on how he's done it. Now he started an anti-Trump website. He's saying he's a conservative, but no longer Republican.
Yeah, this is Mark.
Oh, go ahead, Marty.
So I'm not really sure that it's necessarily appropriate to follow behind somebody who's doing these kind of things, because it's he might be the one that's the Manchurian candidate that's oh yeah, let's go with Trump, and then now let's go with this other one. So it's kind of like keeping everything off keel. So
Yeah.
I do understand that local efforts are what we need. If you think through on the Georgist theory that we capture the local rent, and if we can get the income tax to be abolished, then we're taking care of our local needs, and there's no need to shift all this money to DC only
Exactly.
money back. So I think those are the kind of concrete things that we need to look at and just pose those questions, because it's like, well, why are we doing this? And why is necessarily Cuomo saying I need this many billions and dollars because of the coronavirus or the riots, when possibly he could just make the point, like cancel income tax and we'll collect the land rent. I mean, it sounds outrageous, and maybe not a lot of people would go for it, but the logic is so pure that to do something else, it's kind of like
The logic is clear to us.
Yeah.
But the logic is not generally clear. So, for example, in terms of a incremental mitigation, and I don't know the answer to this, I'm going to ask Dave, is, many activists in the United States believe in political reform, proportional representation being one, public payment for campaigns, shorter campaigns, term limits, all of these things. At least it seems to be that in Europe and in the UK, a third party, like the Green Party, has an opportunity to elect candidates. Is that systemic, Dave? Is it because there's more opportunity to convince people to support the Green Party because it has a chance of winning elections?
Unmute, Dave.
You're on mute, Dave.
Yeah, I am. The Green Party in the UK is very small compared to the other parties, mainly because we don't have proportional representation. But even where we do, like it for the Scottish Parliament, the Welsh Assembly, and the London, Greater London Authority, we only have small number of people representing us, 2 out of 25 here in London, and we only have about a dozen councillors out of hundreds of councillors across London. We're learning the techniques of how to win wards by concentrating our effort on one area and not spreading it thinly across a local authority. So, for example, in Hounslow, we have 20 wards to fight, and we just put up paper candidates in 19 and then fight a battle in what we call our target ward. And that way, certainly it got us more votes in that ward than any other ward, but we were still way behind the two major parties. And what we need to do is, as you say, change the system to proportional representation. That would be helpful. But more importantly, we've got to win the battle of people's hearts and minds. Your question actually implies there might be a short circuit way to try and achieve the changes we want. And I don't think there is a short circuit. But what we have to do is to utilize opportunities when people are thinking differently. You know, at the end of a war, people do tend to think differently. And I think the coronavirus has actually deeply affected people and how they're thinking and what they think is most important in life. Now, that's not going to represent itself as a huge vote for the Greens in this country, but I think it will help the ideas that the Green Party puts across being adopted by other parties. You know, back in the 1970s, the Greens were just dismissed as nut-eating, sandal-wearing fruitcakes. And now the Green arguments are being adopted to some extent by the other parties. But the major thing I was trying to say yesterday is that we've got to stop producing just more stuff. That is destroying the planet. And if you look at the green policies of the Labour Party here in the UK, their aim is more production, to produce more, to make the cake bigger, they say, so that poor people can have a bigger share. But that's not the answer. The answer is, yes, let poor people have bigger share, but of a smaller cake. And I don't think there's any shortcut. We've got to just win the argument for hearts and minds.
Well, your comment about us, producing too much stuff that we really don't need leads kind of to the next question that I want to put to you. I've titled this "Bridging the Ideological Divide," but it's based on Alana's comment yesterday that the rates of individual mortality in communities is directly related to the funding of infrastructure to provide clean water, sanitation, decent housing, education, healthcare, and other basic needs. So it's clearly a large segment of the population that doesn't have access to these, what I would say, goods of a decent human existence. Alana's solution, one we share, is to capture the value of privately held locations and use that as a fund to pay for the public goods and services we want. She then asked those who hold how those who hold power can be convinced that the solution offered in Henry George's writings is their solution as well as our solution. And whether ideologically they're on the left or on the right, is there a politically viable middle ground that bridges the gap? And, you know, I wonder, you know, if the fight has to be an independent political party committed to our principles, or can those on the left and the right be convinced that our principles are their principles as well, and they just don't know it?
I certainly think that's where we need to head. We need to go to the thinking people on the right and the left. I have a slide that shows a statement by Karl Marx side by side with Milton Friedman, side by side with Adam Smith, and they're all talking about the land rent. People don't see that. Marxists even don't know that he got the land question there towards the end. He wasn't even a Marxist as we know it at the end. So Thomas Paine, I mean, there's a lot of information that shows we can really move beyond right and left. But this idea of smallness, like Dave says, the Green Party's small, and we say our movement is small. Let's bring to mind, there's an image of the trim tab. On the big ship, there's a big rudder. But on the big rudder, there's a small little rudder. And that small rudder changes the direction of the big rudder, which changes the direction of the boat. So we shouldn't worry about being small. We have to be skillful in turning our little rudder so that the big rudder turns and the whole boat turns.
Yeah.
I believe that's what we're about as a movement at this time. I believe that is our strategic challenge.
Yeah, this is Marty. I think that's an excellent point, Alana, about don't dismiss the smallness that I think Henry George was talking about. We're not going to take on the issue of land value capture directly. It's going to be through other indirect ways, and I'm thinking that the way to go is there's two activities I'm involved in, and I think both of them kind of contribute to what Alana and Dave were just saying. The first one is an international effort to develop an international standard on the circular economy. And of course, it includes not wasting and to reuse and be regenerative. Essentially, it's a lot of the things that Kate Rayworth was talking about on the donut economy. But one of the things that I'm adding to that discussion is going beyond just the private sector producing stuff economy and look at inclusiveness and equitability and start talking about the public economy, because Mussolini might be in favor of circular economy. After all, everybody knows that he had the trains showing up on time. So I think one of the things we need to do is rally around an approach that people can agree on. I'm not sure when this standard is going to be done, but I'm trying to steer that group to go beyond just what manufacturers might do and look about engaging the public on, is this what we really want? And I think there's an attitude right now in the group of course this is what everybody wants. Yeah, everybody wants a green economy, but I think we need to open up the opportunity for somebody to say, well, wait a minute, this is not the way to implement it, or we need to do this or that, and have that dialogue. And I think that's one of the things that's missing. The other activity I'm involved in is there's a standard on infrastructure management, and that gets to Henry George's point, was that the standard looks at all 15 types of infrastructure that you might have in a city, whether it's water or buildings, communication, healthcare, police and parks and all these things. And it's available right now so that any city or military base or university wants to have an effective infrastructure system, they can borrow this system. It's called E3210, which I have a link to a presentation that I made on the paper that's associated with my presentation yesterday. And I think I mentioned that you just go to academia.edu and put in my name, you can get it. But the idea behind it is that when you have that discussion of this is what we're going to do and this is how we're going to measure it, and the authority says, well, here's where we are on our activities, what do you guys all think? There's always that opportunity for the Georgists to say, what do you mean we can't afford this? Have you looked at the land value tax? So it's kind of subversive in that way, but it's available right now. And I think that people could be running for office saying that I'm going to run this city according to this model. So, you know, even though we're a small group, there's tools out there that are available to start shifting the thinking.
A question that was raised by Giannis seems to be, relevant to this. He directed it to Lana, but generally his opinion is he thinks that the division in our societies are more superficial than real. And he thinks in particular the American people are getting more and more united. How do you see that? And Dave, how do you see that in terms of the population in the UK?
I think, looking at the comments in the chat, people are asking, can you get rid of the bridging the ideological divide thing? And they want bigger pictures of the speakers.
This is Dan Sullivan. If anybody who's watching this, if you move, there's a little bar between the picture of the screen share and the speakers. And if you take that little bar, you grab that with your mouse and slide it to the left, the screen share will get bigger and the screen share will get smaller and the speakers will get bigger. And then after you've done that, you can click up in the top right corner. It says, if you're in gallery view, you can click speaker view, and then you will just see one speaker at a time and he'll be quite large.
I think the comment is that perhaps we can take the slide off and just have the people speaking be large on the screen.
Yeah, you can. It's not necessary if people know how to.
I'm reducing down the PowerPoint pretty small now. How's that?
Well, you're only reducing it on your screen.
Oh,
This
really?
is something every audience member has control of his own screen.
Ah, okay.
So I'm going to edit this out when we go to YouTube, but basically anyone who wants to see a bigger picture of the person and a smaller picture of the screen needs to take his mouse, hold down the left button and slide the mouse and grab that little bar between the two and slide it to the left.
I can't see the little bar you're talking about. I'm trying to do it.
So where are we on the discussion? I forgot the last question.
Well, we'll move on to the next question that I have for you. I think we've covered that pretty well. And Alana in her talk talked about the very constituencies that would materially benefit from a tax shift, in particular small farmers and the business people that are dependent upon the farmers and their relationship. And that the tax shift that we embrace would really go a long way to achieving food security and food sufficiency that would be independent of the current system that's dominated by corporate agribusiness. So I guess the question that came to me in listening to you, Alana, first to you, but the others as well, is what would be the most effective means of selling this to those very constituencies? When you talk to a group of farmers.
When I was working on the legislation so that the boroughs in Pennsylvania could have the right to implement land value tax, the State Agriculture Association was concerned about its impact on farmers, even though there are very few farms within the boroughs, within the towns. But nevertheless, to address their concern, and we had a hearing about this where I presented a paper that had documentation, 15 references, and drew a large part from Mason Gaffney, and showed that very clearly from statistics from his research that if you remove taxes, most small farmers have their houses, they have their buildings, they have their labor. If you take the taxes off of those things, which are more for small farmers relative to a big corporate thousands of acres of land, they don't have the barns, the little barns and everything. If you take the taxes off of their productive capital and their income, and you shift it onto their land value, given that even most there's underassessment in agricultural land, usually it gives farmers a break. So there's already underassessed land. But so if you shift it to the land value, they're going to come out ahead. It's just like when you go to homeowners and show how most homeowners, and you can show the statistics, you can show the numbers of how most homeowners in many places, most places will pay less with the tax shift. You can show that to farmers also. This does bring up a question I had to Dave in terms of how you're actually approaching land value tax implementation. Do you have numbers crunched in the UK that show who pays more, who pays less, and exactly how it will work in a certain city, how the impact will be on a poor neighborhood? That was one of my questions I had to Dave. And another one was, what about a direct land rights, to others of you as well, direct land rights movement? Because the Green Party people like the idea of small farms and ecological villages and so on. And you have a massive amount, as we do in the US, of underutilized land. How about the direct land rights movements, where underutilized land, we would support them becoming land trusts so that homeless and impoverished people can form small farming communities?
I certainly endorse people that want to have a campaign for community land trusts, for land rights and things of that nature. I always argue with them that it's not alone, not enough on its own. It's got to be in hand with the idea of collecting the rent of land for public purposes. And I actually have difficulties there, because many of them just want to go out and do a bit of small steading for themselves, have a couple of acres and try and live self-sufficient on that. And they ignore the fact that the huge rent of land in our country is in the town centres, and particularly in the City of London. And their thinking doesn't go beyond just having their own 2 acres, a couple of cows and a pig, and not thinking about how we are being robbed by the people who control the land in our town centres, our urban areas. So that, I think, is vitally important, that we have the dialogue. We don't say they're wrong. I welcome community land trusts. I think it was Karl Marx that said, an ounce of experience is worth a ton of theory. And they do come eventually to the land tax idea once they're trying to get hold of land for their own purposes. They realise that there is a huge land problem, and it can be tackled successfully with an LVT. But it's not an easy conversation. And similarly, Ed raised the question, do we need a new political party that promotes land rights or collecting land rent? And I don't see that as the future. I see the future is convincing people to convince their politicians. Tony Benn, our left-wing leader for many years in this country, used to say, don't waste your time convincing the politicians, convince the voters, because then the politicians will change to please their voters.
Dave, Alana started out asking you whether or not there's any institution or think tank that's crunching numbers to say that if there's a shift, a tax shift, who will benefit and by how much, who will pay more by how much? Do you have that kind of data in the UK to work with?
The simple answer is no. We invited Ted Waltney to come over and do some land valuations in the area of the Jubilee Line extension. And they found it very difficult because there is no basic data on land value in this country, unlike I can go to Toledo in the United States and for a couple of dollars buy a disc that shows all the land values of Toledo. Nothing like that exists here. There isn't the land value base to work on. So therefore we have to estimate and it's more guesstimate than estimate. And there is a website that you can put your house postcode in and it will show you what your land value tax contribution would be compared to your current council tax. And obviously people in areas like mine in London, it's your land value tax would be a much higher bill than what we currently pay in council tax. In low areas, low land value areas, it's the reverse. But the problem with that program is that it doesn't take into account the fact that empty land would be paying a land value tax, and so the total amount to be collected is less, would be less than currently from individual householders. It doesn't take into account that a land value tax would help the economy expand and grow, and that's not taken into account. The people's incomes would go up under a land value tax. That isn't shown. And so therefore, I've got a lot of criticisms. I've asked for it to be taken out of the web because I think it's misleading people, because it is so complicated in this country. Until we have an assessment of land values across the whole country, you can do it in the global. Heather, my wife, published a booklet, a pamphlet, in which she did a global, for the UK, assessment of land values and said how much rent would be collected by the state at different percentages of land value tax. But, you know, again, that was a guesstimate, but it's on broad figures. It doesn't go down to the individual. And I think it's very important that we do try and get it to the individual. But before we do that, we need values of land. And we've asked Parliament, can you please do that? You know, without having a land value tax, just demand that our valuation office agency actually values land and publishes the values of every site in the country.
Of everything you said, Dave, the one statement that you made that really troubled me the most is that you had to invite an American assessor to come over to help the United Kingdom identify what the land values were in a particular geography.
That's right.
Well, that's a sad tale. Let me get to the next issue that I have on my agenda. The right to access clean water and how this relates also to climate change. It's kind of a systemic, holistic issue. You know, as climate change is occurring, some people are getting more water than they could ever hope for at the wrong times, causing flooding, and other parts of the world are having increasing droughts and these wildfires, et cetera, et cetera. And, you know, I guess the question is, to what extent do you think the adoption of the Georgist tax shift would provide the funding to deal with these systemic climate change issues?
So this is Marty. If we're going to talk about water supply, that's one thing. If we're talking about water pollution, I think it's something else. But you
don't think they're intimately related, Marty?
Well, let me clarify something, because you made a misstatement that we're not scientists, and I guess I feel that being a professional engineer and an environmental engineer license that qualifies me as a scientist with the values of economics.
I apologize.
That's okay, but the supply of water is kind of complex, and I spent a lot of time in reality and in the workfare and workspace and academia on groundwater, and became an expert on Louisiana, for example, and the aquifers there as opposed to the aquifers in Florida, for example, and they flow at a very different rate. And for example, it's kind of unusual, but around Tampa, they have the same kind of aquifers as they do in San Antonio, because both of them were at the ocean's edge at one time. They got limestone. So there's if you want to go someplace where you probably never run out of water, it'd be San Antonio, with all the rains that fall, and it goes directly into the caverns, and so they get their year's supply of water with one rainfall. But so it's very specific on where you're at with water supply. But in situations like in Louisiana, where you pump sands, they're over pumping like 10 times what the recharge rate is, so that you got this lag effect. And so you think you're doing fine and dandy, but then you look at the recharge rate is so low that you'll never catch up. So there's a lot of science behind water supply. So it makes a lot of sense to have people that are using the water to be close to the source, and that's why New York State is such a New York City is positioned so well with getting water out of the Catskills and the Adirondacks. So getting control of the pollution really does go back to that circular economy concept where people can buy in on it. And one of the things I thought that Alana said that was very smart was the idea of the message. And if you kept saying land rights as opposed to green, let's say, it goes very directly to what we're all talking about. So if maybe in political circles we use that terminology, that might allow us to get closer to where the deal is, because I think maybe there's too much baggage on saying I'm from the Green Party, and then you have to explain that I'm working on a subset of that philosophy, and then by the time you explain that, you've lost somebody. But water policy is something that's very specific, and I think we need to provide tools for people to be able to use to get closer to where we're needing to go.
Lana, do you care to add anything to what you said?
Another reason to charge pollution taxes is to keep the water clean and the air around it clean, right? And water is a human right. So there's an ecocide, crime against the ecology, that needs to be, is coming forward now. So polluters are creating ecocide. They need to stop. They need to either be arrested or fined significantly or taxed until they quit the damage. People in drought areas are fleeing as refugees. They need places to go, or else they're going to need water shipped in, just like we need to have gasoline shipped into our gas stations on tank trucks and through tank ships. We're going to, the people will need water shipped in. I mean, should they have to pay the full price, or can there be ideally a global resource agency that equitably distributes resource rents so that all people everywhere can have basic needs met? in the idea of Jubilee, those who, this is the Torah part of it, not in Leviticus, but in the Torah writings, rabbis are saying, what about those who live closer to the market, which would have been Jerusalem? They have an advantage over those who live further out. Well, those who live closer to the market would pay a cash value to those who live further out to equalize labor on land. So perhaps if the people in the drought area, they would have, by right to water, should have some resource rent from other parts of the world if they're going to need to buy water to secure their life. The other thing in terms of technologies is we need to upscale the desalination technologies. This is a water planet. It's a massive water planet. The technology there is there to take the salt out of the water. It's just expensive and complicated. Marty would have way more to know and understand about those details than I do, certainly. So maybe he could tell us a little about the technology of water desalination.
Yeah, I did my doctoral dissertation on comparing Tampa and Baton Rouge water systems. And Tampa, they just got tired of being impacted by droughts. They had a big drought in the early 90s. So in order to resolve their problem, and this really gets to the point of common pool resource management, which a lot of people dismiss as hippies in the mountains someplace sharing stuff. But in Tampa, they actually implemented a common pool system in a very conservative area by having 3 counties share their resources. So they stopped suing each other because of overlapping claims, and they integrated all their supplies. But one of the things they did to top it all off, they built a desalination system. And you can get a tour of the plant if you go down there and just ask. The Tampa Water, and actually there's a guy named John Kennedy that you could look him up and say, give me a tour. But it is expensive, but what it does, having the desalination, it provides that cover that if there ever were a drought, they would have that extra amount. So in combining that with all the rainfall capture they have and their rivers and groundwater, they do have desalination, and they run it like once a month just to keep everything up. But it's a technology, and then if you go to the item that I was talking about yesterday, the possibility that there's helium-3 on the moon, which could create the fuel for a fusion reactor, and price of energy comes down, we're solving some problems right there. So no matter how you do it, there are solutions. We just need to put the solutions in a logical order.
The challenge that I'm putting to, in a sense, is related again to whether or not we have time enough to react. I mean, to make systemic change. And since we can't get there, perhaps, then what do we do in the interim? So to look at New York and London, just as 2 examples of millions of people living right at the sea level. I mean, London has its measures to try to keep the sea back. New York I've seen plans for a giant wall around the southern end of Manhattan Island to keep the sea out as it's rising. Something like 65% of the world's population lives within 50 miles of the coast. What happens? I mean, what's going to happen in the interim, in the short period, to a place like London, Dave? Are the civic leaders thinking about these issues and realistically putting funds into the infrastructure necessary to keep the Thames back, as the ocean rises? Or the same thing, I have a question for New York, and it applies to hundreds of cities all around the world.
I was a member of the Greater London Council, the authority that built the Thames Barrier. and Woolwich. And we envisage that the Thames barrier would be closed perhaps a couple of times a year, normally when there was the spring tides that are very high. And that was back in the early 1980s. Today, the Thames barrier closes 3 or 4 times a week because of the water coming in. And there's very much a discussion whether or not we need to build a new Thames barrier, bigger, higher, and farther downstream, closer to the sea. It would be much more expensive than the original Thames barrier because it would need to be much bigger. I remember at the time we had an executive committee discussion about insurance. We were worried that there might be a spring tide and somebody might press the wrong button. Instead of the thing closing, it stays open and the whole of London gets flooded. And we thought, well, we'll take out insurance for that just in case it happens. But the premium for the insurance was so great that we just said, well, forget about it. If the whole of London gets flooded, then it's a national disaster and the national government would have to bail us out, literally. So we didn't insure. But your earlier question about the climate change, it isn't just a question of the fires and the water and what have you. It's what we can do now, and things like burning less fossil fuels immediately is one of the answers. And I, as I said yesterday, feel very strongly that tax incentives can play an important part in people's behaviour. And we need big tax incentives to encourage people to drive electric, to ride cycles, to walk journeys, to use public transport, rather than keep burning fossil fuel. And also in terms of construction, in terms of lorries, Marty mentioned today that he commented on freight tubes, and I'd like to discuss that with Marty later, because it's not my original idea. It's a guy in Oxford, Noel Hodson, and I'd like to put you two guys in touch if that's possible.
Marty, did you want to say anything about New York's plans or its measures that it's put into place?
Yeah, I know of a few things, and I know about some of the complications. It has to do with whether there should be a barrier closer to the water, or should we allow the water to naturally come up the slopes wherever there are some slopes. It's kind of a choice between costs, and there's a lot of complications about contaminants that are below ground, and how much it costs to dig up and haul away the stuff that you'd have to do to put in the barrier. One of the things that in New York shares with London is that we got these below ground train systems, and the challenge of keeping those dry. Yeah. So in terms of the climate change, the only thing that seems to make sense is to move people from areas that are going to be flooding out. Now, I did kind of interesting thing that's going on too is that with the discussion about climate change, there are some people taking advantage of that opportunity in a speculative way, where people want to get out of the close access to the water, so they pick up properties real cheap by people that want to get out, and they buy them cheap, and then for the people who have short horizon, they make a killing. So sometimes there's a nefarious element going on. But I do know a little bit about that, and those options of of where to put the barrier, where to allow the water to go up. But, you know, it's like after Katrina, which I went through in New Orleans, you know, a lot of people were just building their houses like 6 feet in the air. They would just jack them up. And I'm thinking that that might be the way to go, where we just create a synthetic surface, where whether it's a concrete or something else, where you just anticipate it. And I suppose if it ever gets too high, you just start doing your city planning like Venice.
Yeah, exactly. Canals in New York and London.
Yeah.
Eliminate the first 6 floors of the building.
Yeah.
Replace it with pillars.
Yeah.
Well, this is definitely a land rights issue, with 65% living about 50 miles from the ocean, like Ed said. Refugees fleeing, where are they going to go? For many reasons, refugees fleeing. And you have so few owning and controlling so much of the Earth's surface in nearly every country. I mean, UK, USA, Brazil, there's plenty of land where people to settle away from the coast. Plenty of land. It's access. Okay, that's what we're all about. And I think we can use these many different issues and show the injustice, and also, even because sometimes people wake up with a little bit of fear, like, oh my gosh, what's going to happen if your neighborhood's flooded in New York, or it could be any time, maybe you better move out. My daughter and her husband and their baby, I was in New York February 5th for the baby's birth, and then COVID hit, and by mid-March they were living here. And they think they'll never go back to New York, just because they realize a small two-room apartment is not a really great way to raise a child, even if you're living near the beautiful Central Park and all the amenities that the city offers. And I've heard there's quite a few people who have left New York and are considering not returning. Some people have places to go, and poor people get stuck. So there again, we need the division of the land rights for the poor people. Where are they going to go? They have a right to be somewhere.
This comment just occurred to me. It's somewhat relevant, and economists talk about the concept of labor mobility, and they point to New York City as a place where there is a high level of labor mobility, because the rate of home ownership is lower than in most other
Gosh.
and it's an interesting, you know, it's from their perspective, it has a certain positive character to it, but from the standard of what we consider to be wealth building, you know, home ownership, at least in the United States, and I would assume in the UK, is very much based on the net worth one has in their residential property, both your house and land. No, I don't want to talk about that. There's a comment that's been posted by Mark and Osamu, and I don't want to discuss this, but I think it's worth at least acknowledging it. And they write, how can we, who want to change to benefit everyone, appeal to the right? On what basis? We do need to reach not only to thinking people, but also to caring people. But are sufficient thinking and caring people on the right? What is the right-wing value system of the right besides fear of human diversity? Should we really appeal to fear? So that's just something to think about. And, you know, maybe when Dan does a session with individuals who have a much more libertarian or individualist or even conservative point of view, they might have a response to that observation. But let me go on to the next slide. We have only about 10 minutes left before we finish up, and I just titled this one "Government Action for the Common Good," and I got this based on Dave's comments in his presentation about the huge difference in living conditions between the haves and have-nots, and as this is revealed by illnesses and deaths caused by COVID-19. And I think, Alana, you sort of talked about the same thing.
Yeah.
Dave's lesson is we must work together. We must cooperate rather than compete if we're going to ever solve the problems of humanity and the planet. he uses the terms interchangeably, green socialism or cooperativism. And this is defined to include constructive government action. So the question that occurred to me out of all this is, how do we assure that whatever the degree of government action is taken, are those actions in fact constructive? How can we know before they're taken, or is there always going to be the law of unforeseen consequences that we have to deal with in terms of government action and public policy?
Well, I could start and say that one way is to utilize the tool that I was referring to, where we agree with what is it that we want to do, what resource, what infrastructure we want to provide, and how we're going to get that, and have a frank discussion with the authority that's providing it, and do kind of like a bottoms up look at it. Another thing that I did want to talk about, and I don't want to get off on too much of a tangent, but I watched Gone with the Wind last night for the first time, and it occurred to me that a lot of values that were expressed in that movie are ones that are still current in the United States, and it's almost as if maybe not the South won the war, but a lot of the values are there, and it makes me think that the people on the West and East coasts have this service idea of the tough, dirty jobs can go overseas, and so you got this division within the United States. It's kind of an interesting way of looking at the problem before us. That perhaps if you view our current problem in terms of the division that we had 150 years ago, maybe it would be fruitful for a discussion.
Well, getting back to this particular issue, how important are stakeholder group meetings? Like, when an infrastructure project is being proposed, getting the people in the community together to hear their opinions and actually be listened to.
Yeah, well, I hate to keep bringing it up, but I created this standard on how you engage people, and once the authority that's delivering this thing agrees to use this tool, they're bound to do it according to that agreement. It's almost like a social contract. So without, I do invite people to look at the presentation that I made on May 20th. But yeah, if you have just public meetings, the dog and pony shows, it's really not going to go anywhere, because it's the old Tammany Hall corruption machine. But you have to have the tools and to move forward. There was another idea that I wanted to bring up, is that the Black Lives Matter protests seem to hit a nerve in terms of changing policy, and maybe land right people can't sustain a protest movement for 20 days, but they definitely had something there.
There's participatory budgeting, which started in Brazil a number of years ago and now is in dozens of cities, if not hundreds. And that is where the people themselves get to decide where their budget goes to. 50% or more of their city budget is decided by the people themselves. And they take this very seriously. They divvy up their city into sections, and they meet together publicly, or they could by Zoom, I guess, but they meet together and have very serious discussions about how they want their people's money spent in their city.
Yeah.
So they're tracking it. They're actively engaged. And if consultants like Marty can show what's going to cost to this, and this, but then to trust that the people, there's going to be enough people, and they are interested.
Well, that's good. That's good.
I often say, hey, in terms of taxation, how come I can buy a candy bar or something at a store, bottle of milk, and get a receipt, but I can pay income taxes to the federal government and I'm not getting any receipt. They're not telling me, they're not itemizing for me how this is spent. But a city budget does that. A city budget is transparent, all right? So that is how the people themselves can see the results of how their money is being spent locally. Participatory budgeting, look it up. It's, I think, a really important movement for us.
Dave, do the comments from Marty and Alana sort of, ring to your sense of this is in the right direction of green socialism or cooperativism?
I feel very much that people believe in fairness. You look at most of the arts, the media, films, stuff like that, and many of the stories about injustice and how people overcome injustice. And the question for me is, how do we explain to people that the land tenure system is one huge injustice based upon theft? And one thing I'd like to see is an author write a book about, in the UK or in Scotland, about the Scottish Highland clearances, in England, about the way that land was just stolen. Common land that people all had access to was stolen. And there must be some clever person who could, perhaps a J.R.K. Rowling or somebody like that, who could write a story that actually stirs people up to realise that our birthright has been stolen from us. And we need to be able to encourage people to think for themselves and not just accept what is in the media. And maybe one way to do that is to try and get the media to put over our ideas. Over the years, there's been an economist who's now at a university writing in The Guardian. And on many occasions, he has mentioned land value tax over the years. Today, I read an article he put in The Guardian this weekend, and he's talking about policies needed after the coronavirus. One is to have a youth project, so every young person between the age of 16 and 25 has a guaranteed job. And the other is that government should spend money that it hasn't got and just print banknotes to cover the expenditure. Nothing radical at all. And I was really disappointed because this is a bloke who has explained LVT to others in the past, and today, at this time, he is actually ignoring it. So that depressed me this morning when I read that. But nevertheless, I am always a half full person, not a half empty person, glass. And so therefore I live in high hopes, even though I'm in my late 70s, that before I expire from this planet, that I will see every country in the planet collecting natural resource wealth.
Well, we're just about out of time for and this exchange has been extremely enjoyable for me to participate in. I hope everyone has gotten a good bit out of it. I was going to ask you each one last thing, if you could do it in 30 seconds to a minute, and that is, how do you define the right balance between human rights and property rights, which I think is the fundamental issue at the basis of what we've been searching for?
Can I go first on that? In the charters for human rights, there always is an inclusion of property rights. And in our country, particularly in Scotland, when I've talked to landowners there, they use that as an argument why their land should not be taxed, because they have this human right to own their property. And I would like to see these human right charters changed so that the only property right that people have is what they've made themselves. People ignore the property as two parts. You've already mentioned it earlier today, Ed, that there's the building and there's the land. And yes, they should have a right to the privacy of the building, that is theirs, but the land is not an individual right unless they pay the rent for that land to the whole community. And that should be in all of these charters of human rights.
Well said, Dave. Alana, do you care to weigh in on this last issue?
When Eleanor Roosevelt was a leader in putting together the International Charter for Human Rights, became part of the United Nations in the late 1940s, the right to land would have been a third rail. It would have killed all the work. The International Declaration for Economic Human Rights, food, shelter, clothing, all of these things that we want, has been a big debate because if you have a right to shelter, who's going to provision that right? Does that mean the government has to provision it if you need shelter? They just never touch upon the fundamental human right to the earth. That's where we come in. We need to get all kinds of little memes everywhere that says earth rights for all, human right to the earth.
Thank you, Alana. Marty?
Yeah, well, I like what Dave had to say about making that very specific, the property right being to what you made, because it gets to the heart of what we have to say. But one of the difficulties that we're always going to have is the universities and all the schools bowing down to the authority of neoclassical economics, and that's the source of the confusion over what we're trying to do. So maybe in jest, I'd say we take all the books on neoclassical economics, burn them, and generate some heat out of them.
There you go.
Get some one last kick out of it, and make a program for an economics that we can live with in the 22nd century, I think.
Great. Well, thanks. That's an excellent final comment on our conversation. I hope that everyone who has attended has gotten something out of it. We weren't able to get all the questions dealt with that came up in the Q&A session, but I think we've had a really, really thoughtful discussion, some sharing of great ideas and insights. And with that, I will turn it over to Dan to close out the session.
Okay, thank you. Nothing in particular except to say once again that this is made possible by a grant of the Robert Schalkenbach Foundation. And where did I set my list of the Foundation for Economic Justice, the Henry George Institute, Common Ground USA, Earth Sharing Institute, and private donations. Thank you. And
tune in on Tuesday for competitive assessing with our own Nick Tiedemann and a respondent by the name of Ted Courtney. So it'll be good. We'll send out the codes probably tomorrow morning. So
as in Tuesday is
the 16th.
This is primarily Nick Tiedemann's presentation.
Right.
So the last week we had Ted Courtney's presentation with Nick Tiedemann commenting, and this is Nick Tiedemann's presentation with Ted commenting.
So Dan, tell us about your bike shop that's on your t-shirt.
Oh, it's not mine, but it's a great bike shop.
Okay. Thanks.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.